Thank you for having us. To my right is Claire Wardle. Claire is a current fellow at TED and executive chairwoman of First Draft, which is a nonprofit that works with journalists around the world to tackle and fight disinformation. To my left is Leticia Duarte, who was a senior reporter at Zero Hora, which is a translation from Portuguese that means 0 hour. She has covered all sorts of stories in enterprise and investigative fashion, including the immigration crisis in Europe. She's currently at Columbia writing her thesis on disinformation in Brazil. Also joining us on the panel is Chidu Rajghatta, who is an opinion columnist and foreign editor of the Times of India, also an author of 2 books, and joins us from Washington, D.C., correct?
Thank you very much. Yes.
So I thought that since it's Friday at 5:30 in the spring, as the weather is finally warming, everyone here must be super fluent and committed to disinformation and know all of the technical definitions of the difference between every form of what I call fake news, and which Claire will not let me use those words.
Nope.
So what better way to spend a Friday evening than to start off with Claire defining these words so that we can actually have a conversation that uses these words responsibly. So I'm going to give you 3 words that I think we are most likely to use during the next 40 minutes, and you can define them for us.
Okay, Adam.
Okay?
Yeah, it's like a new podcast.
Yeah.
Okay, I love it.
Disinformation.
Yes.
Misinformation.
Yes.
And malinformation.
Got you. So I'm going to start with misinformation. So misinformation is false information, but when it gets shared, people don't realize it's false and they're not meaning to do any harm. So I often use the example of my mum resharing an image of a shark swimming up a highway after a hurricane. She doesn't know that that shark doesn't exist. She's not trying to do any harm. That is distinct from disinformation, which is also false, but the people who are sharing it or creating it know it's false and are intending to do harm. Malinformation is genuine information, but the sharing of that is designed to cause harm. So examples like revenge porn or some leaks, potentially emails that are moved from a private setting to a public setting, that is genuine information, but it's being weaponized. And so my refusal to use the term F*** news, and it did come up a lot in the previous panel around discussions of how it's being used to weaponize journalists. There are many words in our language that we now don't use because we know they are harmful. This is a word that's being weaponized and used against the news industry. There are other words that we can use, and I know it's easy for search engine optimization terms to use that, but recent research shows that when you talk to audiences about it, they believe that that term really describes the New York Times or the BBC or CNN. The more we use it as academics and journalists and researchers, the more the public thinks it's about professional news media. So we're actually shooting ourselves in our feet.
Yeah, and it's been hijacked for all sorts of purposes, political, and people with other agendas are just using it broadly and widely.
And it doesn't actually describe the complexity. So if we're serious about tackling this, using a term that hides the complexity doesn't help us.
Okay, great. I think we can put an end to the definition segment of this evening. I thought that maybe Chidu could bring us into the situation that requires a little more urgency, which is, I believe, currently over this current 6-week period is one of the biggest elections in the history of the world. 900 million people in India are voting. What's that?
The biggest?
The biggest.
Yeah, absolutely.
What is happening there when it comes to disinformation? What are you seeing? What worries you the most?
Gosh, the end result. So, well, I don't know. I think the New York Times ran a Q&A with the election commissioner, Indian election commissioner, and he described it so eloquently. It is just a staggering exercise, 900 million people. But what is striking is this is also being called the first WhatsApp election. Some people are actually saying that we're going to have a WhatsApp democracy. I don't know how that squares. But in India, everything is scale. You have to remember. I frequently joke when people ask me, I say I work for a small newspaper called the Times of India, but then we're a small country of 1 billion people. So 5 million, which is Times of India circulation, 5 to 6 million on Sundays, means nothing in this scale. So what is striking to me about this election is it comes at a time where the cell phone penetration in India, there's 1 billion cell phones now. And I think the latest estimates put the number of smartphones at about 450 million. 450 million smartphones. You combine that with the country which has the cheapest data, right? Data in India is incredibly cheap. Every year, I go home 2 or 3 times a year, and every time I'm just struck by how cheap it is now to rent a cell phone. So you're basically, data is, I think, 25 cents per gigabyte compared to US $10 to $12 a gigabyte. Dirt cheap data, everybody equipped with cell phones, smartphones, or at least cell phone, and massive amounts of information and disinformation, misinformation, malinformation. All the players, and it's not just the ruling party, it's the opposition, it's the small regional parties, everyone in this constantly, putting out, manipulating, countering, in all this, there are also enablers, and obviously the biggest enablers are the social media companies, and I'll talk about it later, but Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp being Facebook's property is also part of this. Massive amounts of misinformation, media manipulation, very hard to monitor. Again, scale. You're talking of a country which is, 1.3 billion. The electorate is 900 million. And probably 600 million people will end up voting, and incredibly discrete and diverse society, myriad languages, myriad cultures. So you have at least 10 languages spoken by 50 million or more people. Very hard to monitor. So even I'd say feeble attempts by social media companies, Facebook and Twitter, to somehow get a handle on this massive, outpouring of misinformation, malinformation has a very limited effect. So,
can you actually describe that cat and mouse game that's happening? Because the platforms have taken some steps in India, to my understanding, to try to clamp down on different areas where it's
right.
But it looks like there's a counter move for every first.
Absolutely. We often joke that in India, somebody sets up rules, and an Indian will always find a way to circumvent that rule. It happens in our traffic all the time. The traffic lights are just a broad indication of how one should drive. Nobody really obeys it, and that's pretty much happening specifically in WhatsApp. For instance, WhatsApp decided that because of the way rumors were spreading virally, that they'd try and limit the number of forwards, that you could do at any given time. You could forward it. I think they limited it to 5 people.
From like 250 or something.
But what happened was, the counter to that was political parties and even groups started forming multiple groups, multiple cells. So although it slowed down the process, the overall effect, it didn't change very much. Rumors still get around. I like to, that saying about how rumors halfway around the world while truth is still tying its shoelaces. That was always true even in the legacy era, even with the print era it was true. We had 18,000 newspapers in myriad languages, and there was always a struggle for credibility. But now the fuel is social media. It's so much faster, so much quicker, and it's simply out of control.
And can you just briefly talk us through one of the more, what I think is a sophisticated and just sensational recent case of disinformation in terms of the fake video of the Indian military allegedly striking a Taliban cell in Pakistan? And I just want to note that one of the themes in our film on disinformation is that while we in the West are often looking back to try to understand what happened in a certain case, and it takes 2 years to issue a report and come to a consensus, the technology is moving rapidly and changing every 3 to 6 months. Mm-hmm. And I think this case involved a level of sophistication that was sort of unheard of, at least in the West a year ago or something in terms of
Absolutely.
video games and deep fakes.
Absolutely. So I'm assuming most people would be familiar with this spat between India and Pakistan, which resulted following a terrorist attack in Kashmir. Indian warplanes crossed the line of control into Pakistan and bombed what the Indians said was a terrorist headquarters. There was not enough visual evidence, although even the Pakistanis agreed that the Indian forces had crossed, Indian Air Force planes had crossed. But the Indians claimed that 300 soldiers, 300 terrorists had been killed in this strike in a place called Balakot, where the terrorist headquarters was located. No visual proof, but very quickly in the Indian social media scene, there were photographs and videos of dead bodies, which were basically from other attacks, which were, sort of pieced together and presented. And this happens all the time. Just today, actually, I saw photographs of Rahul Gandhi, who is the opposition Congress party leader and prospective prime minister should his coalition win. He's single and he's in his 40s, so there is this kind of, I'd say, stigma about being 40s and single. So there were pictures of him. Apparently, he has a Colombian wife and 2 children. And they just photoshopped an actress, an American actress of Hispanic origin, and it's all over the social media. And those who want to believe it will believe it. And there are fact checkers. It's been flagged down, but again, this is rumor which is halfway around the world before truth's got its shoes on.
And I don't know if it's true, but I read that some of the stills and the videos from this disinformation campaign were taken from a video game, and they were purported to be from like Indian military radar systems. But the video games and these devices on weaponry look very similar.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, like I said, there's the other problem here is there's also very limited digital literacy. I mean, as it is, conventionally there's a low literacy in India, or modest literacy, I'd say 60 to 70% literacy, but digital literacy is probably even lower. So people tend to believe anything that's out there, and if it's visual. As you all know, we produce movies on a grand scale, and most of them are fantastic, nonsense. But imagine that, on your device, cheap bandwidth, everyone can afford it. The poor, I mean, it's incredible. I'm now beginning to think that in India, people can't afford, food maybe, but they sure can afford bandwidth. It's so cheap.
So I want to shift to Brazil, but before we do that, I have a quick question for you. You work and talk to the platforms often, and I'm aware that I believe 4 or 5 years ago in India, Facebook was consulting and advising and working with Modi and other political parties to help them maximize their campaigns on Facebook. And I know that in recent years they've taken a step back, and they're much more cautious and aware of the consequences of this consultancy. So an optimist might say that this is late change, but at least it's change, and they're starting to understand the consequences and implications, and maybe even starting to have some values. And I'm wondering if that's something that we can be hopeful about, or is that just a baby step that's far too late and almost irrelevant?
No, I mean, we have to recognize that these platforms are still very, very young. And I think one of the reasons that we're in the mess that we're in is that there was many young men of Silicon Valley designing these platforms, and they were very optimistic. They'd had lovely lives. They'd all gone to great universities and got straight A's, and they thought that by connecting people, they would save the world. And nobody had said to them, political advertising, that's not the same as selling toothpaste. Because they had built an advertising mechanism to drive these platforms, but nobody had said there's different types of advertising. And so they were like, well, it's worked to advertise toothpaste, we'll just do the same for politicians. So they went to the Philippines and they advised Duterte, they went to India, because they just thought we need as many people as possible on the platforms, and these guys are influencers. And not once did they recognize what they were doing. And so there was no malice there. And so what we're now seeing is them recognizing and pulling back, but in many ways, the harm has gone around the planet and we're now trying to catch up. So I think they are now more aware, they're taking more advice, but I've often said to them, if they spent more time late at night in bars with journalists, we wouldn't be in this mess, because if they talked about Facebook Live, journalists would have said, I'll tell you what you'll see immediately, you'll see suicides, you'll see terrorist incidents, you'll see bad stuff, and they were like, Facebook Live, it'll be for first birthday parties and Christmas. Like, they just in their head couldn't imagine the death and destruction that journalists have lived with and understood, so we should have done that earlier.
Just a side note here, I should point out that I don't know which other world leader visited Facebook headquarters, but Modi did very early on, 2015. He came to Washington, and his only other stop was Silicon Valley. And he and Mark Zuckerberg, I was there for that event, had a sort of tete-a-tete in the Facebook headquarters.
And Facebook staff were embedded with Trump. I mean, Hillary said no, but Trump, I mean, so this is recent.
Yeah. Journalists go to bars, by the way?
Yeah, on Friday nights.
I've never been invited to one of those.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Conferences, yeah. So I hope, Leticia, you don't feel left out that India has stolen your WhatsApp election, because that's how you guys branded it last year, I believe.
Yeah, I'm so sad. So they lost.
Does that all sound eerily familiar to what happened in Brazil?
Yeah, it's pretty familiar, too familiar, I would say. And thank you for inviting me to be here. I hope you can understand my Brazilian accent, even it's Friday night, and talk about Brazilian elections. So it sounds very familiar. But for us, I think it's like now is a new moment, because Bolsonaro is governed for 3 months, and you are seeing like a new step on fake news. They're trying to consolidate fake news as history. And this is very threatening. It's not about threatening the present, but also trying to reshape the past and our memory, the memories of the country. So one example I could mention would be, there's a lot of, Bolsonaro has said the teachers are all communists trying to indoctrinating children. So it seems like funny, but it's very scary for what's happening in the schools. The teachers are suffering censorship, and they're scared to teach some things. I know I went to Brazil to report on that, and some teachers, they are not teaching anymore about Russian Revolution, because they are scared to be accused of being communist, because they are bringing it up, and it's very, very scary. And Bolsonaro is also recommending the students to record the teachers and the classes, and they are exposing on internet. So if a student is watching a class 50 minutes, and they just select 2 minutes and post on internet, oh, look how this teacher is trying to indoctrinate children, and there's a big of hate campaign on internet. And I interviewed some of these teachers. They are all terrified.
So it's disinformation going far beyond the front pages and the broadcasts, but into the schools. It's a completely different terrain.
Yeah, I think it's a kind of a new step, because we discuss often a lot about fake news, but it seems like now they are trying to consolidate as history. And it's not just fake news, but misinformation, disinformation, I know, but we talk a lot. And Bolsonaro came here to the U.S. Trump was so proud, because Bolsonaro was repeating all these mantras. But this new moment, I could mention a teacher I interviewed. She was very terrified, because the student, she had been recorded, and she was teaching a class about the rise of Hitler Youth. It was like Nazism, because if just to contextualize, Bolsonaro has said Nazism was a leftist movement. So recently he went to Israel, and he was there in the Holocaust Museum. And after the visit, he gave a press conference. And in the press conference, he was saying, oh, look, there's no doubt Nazism was a leftist movement. Even he was in Israel, and everyone was denying it. Like the Holocaust Museum was denying it, of course. Like everyone, history in all the world are denying that. But he was just repeating, ignoring the facts. And I think you could discuss something about that, because it seems like the facts don't matter anymore. It's more about, oh, I believe with that, I want to believe that or not. And so it seems like it's a new and scary moment.
Can you, I think one of the things that concerns me is that when there's an election happening, which is the subject of this panel, we sort of pounce on a place and examine it. I mean, the Times has aggressively been covering the election in India recently and previously in Brazil. And then once the election is over, we sort of move on to the next election, which is going to be the EU parliamentary elections. But when elected leaders who wage disinformation campaigns win an election, then they govern. And I'm wondering if you could maybe talk us through a case briefly of something where we're relatively well aware of what the tactics he used to get elected, but has he done anything that's especially egregious in the Brazilian disinformation space since he took office, I think on January 1st?
Yeah, this case with the schools would be something that, like, there's a big discussion in Brazil now about history, and they are like just, it seems like we're in the Cold War again, and like discussing about communism and leftists, and in the schools it's very aggressive because teachers are suffering censorship. And I interviewed a teacher, for example, he was teaching about dictatorship and torture, and Bolsonaro is saying, no, there's no torture in Brazil. And if there's just a few cases, maybe because these people deserve it, because they are very bad guys. So the students, because they believe that they are receiving these messages on WhatsApp all the time, the students are challenging the teachers. And they say, when the teachers say, oh, there's torture, I'm teaching about dictatorship, for example, that lasts 21 years in Brazil, and more than 400 people were killed. And teacher, like I interviewed a teacher, he was teaching about that, and the students are all saying, oh, that's not true. It's not what I saw on WhatsApp. And you were lying to me. You were a communist trying to indoctrinate me. And it's very complicated because Bolsonaro is also attacking the books, and they had a project to change the books. And Bolsonaro has a lot of support from the military. And one of the generals that would support him was saying, oh, all the books that don't tell the truth about the dictatorship should be eliminated. So what we're seeing in like large scale in Brazil now is this they are trying to consolidate this fake news and put in the books, not just on internet. And we don't know yet. It's too soon to know what will be the effects, but I know for fact that the teachers are already changing their classes. And one of the teachers I interviewed, he said, oh, I became a teacher because my dream was to change the future of Brazil. But now the classroom is changing the past. So it's sad.
You mentioned Bolsonaro's visit to Washington. I'm wondering, one of the themes that we looked at a lot in our film was sort of this disinformation playbook that we've seen evolve by different regimes over the decades. But there are certain tenets or commandments that seem to be time-tested. And I'm wondering, as you've been living here for the past year or so, is there anything you can describe where you're seeing these tactics being borrowed from what was either passed on through Washington or invented in Washington, and how much do these two leaders mirror each other?
Yeah, so it's funny for me because here all the American press say Bolsonaro is the Trump of the tropics, but Bolsonaro is not the Trump of the tropics. He wanna be. His is his dream, but he's not. He's kind of much worse than Trump, but he's trying to copy some of the tactics. And maybe you could mention some of I think your film describes so well how is this playbook. And one of the things your film mentioned is how sometimes they start the fake news or the misinformation or like what's not correct. They try to start the story in a foreign country to seeking credibility. Maybe you can talk.
Yeah, it's the concept of concealing your hand or hiding the origin. So we examined the case that the myth that the U.S. Invented the AIDS virus to kill blacks and gays, which was born out of the KGB disinformation campaign in 1983. And the first place that they leaked that story out into the public sphere, they meaning the Kremlin, was a place called New Delhi, because they thought the press in India was communist and left-leaning, and would be also susceptible to this disinformation campaign. So they dropped it in a nameless newspaper called The Patriot, not nameless, but globally nameless, unknown, in New Delhi. And then they leaked it. They got that clip. And then they, months later, they wrote about it in a newspaper in Moscow and said, according to a newspaper in India. And then the third case was an article that they planted in the Argentine press and said, according to the Indian and Russian media or Soviet media. And we eventually tracked this story through 80 countries in over 100 news clippings that basically all quoted each other. But the origin was sort of in a random place in order to conceal your hand. And the modern day internet version of that, as you've studied broadly, is basically creating a sort of quick mom and pop fake website that looks like a news site, and having that story, and then some fringe radio station picks it up, or someone on Reddit picks it up, and then it eventually makes its way to an influential person tweeting it, or a radio show or something.
Yeah, and in an age of WhatsApp, you can do a screen grab, and then it just circulates as a screenshot, and it looks professional, but you can't get any of the provenance because there's none of the metadata, but it looks official, so then that's enough.
So just to answer your question, Bolsonaro copied exactly that tactic, and there was a story in Brazil. There was a Brazilian journalist. She was investigating corruption involving Bolsonaro's son, Flávio. He's in Senate. By the way, Bolsonaro has 3 sons, and all of them, they are in politics, like they are elected for terms. So one of his son, Flávio, he is in Senate now, and he is being investigated for corruption. And this journalist, she was investigating the case, and she was targeted with a massive campaign that started in a blog in French. And it was a publication say, oh, we did a big investigation, and you find out what are the real motivations of this journalist. They just want to destroy Bolsonaro because she's bad, she doesn't like him, something like that. So they published in French, but they had a recording from her because a fake student interviewed her first, previously saying...
like a blogger who was pretending to be a student, yeah?
Yeah. But this blogger, he hired a guy pretending to be a student. And this student said, oh, I'm American, I'm studying, I want to write about Bolsonaro and Trump, I want to compare them, so could you give me an interview talking about how do you see these things and about your work? So she gave this interview, and they manipulate the interview and with some fake subtitles, and they publish in this it's a Mediapart, it was a blog in Mediapart in French. And after they published here in the US in Washington Times, and after that, finally they published in Brazil a blog with very supportive of Bolsonaro saying, oh, a French journalist revealed the real intentions of the Brazilian media, and after that, Bolsonaro also published in his Twitter. So in all the strategy was trying to say, look, it comes from the outside, it's not us that were producing this.
Yeah, and there's sort of the ultimate success in these campaigns is in the AIDS case. The story made its way into the evening news with Dan Rather. We found a clip from 1988 or 89 of him reading this story, and in this case, Bolsonaro ended up tweeting this fake news story via France, via the Washington Times, via his fringe website, or a fringe website.
This just shows you that tactics have always been there. It's just the tools are, there are more tools, there are faster tools. And the really amazing part is anyone can do it. So essentially what we celebrated as the democratization of journalism has basically enabled literally anybody on the street to, Photoshop. I don't know how far making deep fake videos at home. I mean, I'm sure that's probably a few weeks down the line.
Yeah, I mean, can I just say something about deepfakes? Because it was a great question earlier about deepfakes, and it is something we should be aware about, but I am not worried about deepfake. We've got about 5 years until we have a deepfake that is, I think, would make a real difference, and in that time there are very smart people like at Carnegie Mellon who are building technology that looks automatically at things like blood flow in a video. So that famous Obama one, the computer can tell that the blood isn't flowing in the face in the way that you would with a human. So there's this kind of arms race going on. The thing that worries worries me is the drip, drip, drip of the misleading, hyper-partisan, low-level, the tactics we've discussed here. And I think it's also worth bringing up, when we did a project in Brazil with a number of Brazilian newsrooms, and we had a lot of messages in from WhatsApp, 250,000 that we've analyzed, a huge amount of audio messages. We don't talk enough about audio messages here, but in Nigeria, where we worked, in Brazil, and in India too, the idea on WhatsApp that you can just record an audio, there was all this audio of Bolsonaro in the hospital, and it's like, this was Bolsonaro. It wasn't, but our ears are actually more trusting than our eyes. So I'm more worried about the kind of makeshift crappy shit, excuse my language, than I am deep fakes, because there's much more of that, and it's not like our brains have sorted out the crappy shit. So my hope is that very smart computer scientists will solve the deep fakes problem. I'm not sure how we deal with this stuff, because it's much more human.
So as much as I would love to play the gloom and doom role all evening, there is a somewhat hopeful example of an initiative that you led in France, and I was wondering if you could talk us through that, because it's one of the few things I've learned about during my research that
Gave you hope.
Yeah, a little bit, not too much.
No, I was going to say it's hard to make you hopeful.
Yeah.
In November of 2016, we had a meeting in Europe with a number of our European partners who are still reeling from the surprise Trump election. And they said, if you do anything first draft, we would like you to do something around the French election, because we're actually very concerned about Marine Le Pen and what might happen. So we created a coalition of over 30 newsrooms, because our principle is, when it comes to truth, then journalists should be competing. When it comes to cleaning up polluted platforms, journalists should not be competing. That is not the time that we should be competing for scoops or exclusives. And actually, newsrooms who are struggling for resources, it makes more sense to pool resources around disinformation. So in France, we had this coalition of 30 newsrooms working together to monitor and then debunk misinformation. And so we would have a central website, but more powerful was that you had 30 newsrooms, both national and local, that already had the trust of their audiences, amplifying those debunks. It wasn't a new organization, it was using what already existed. And so in 12 weeks, we managed to publish 60 debunks, and when we did our analysis and evaluation afterwards, lots of French people said, I found that trustworthy from both the left and the right, because whether they supported Le Monde and the Parisian elite or their local Strasbourg newspaper, they said the fact that newspapers were working together meant that they believed it was more credible. And so then we tried to see whether that was just a French thing or whether it would work elsewhere. So we did the same initiative in Brazil with 24 newsrooms, and within 12 weeks we had 25% of Brazilian internet users who were aware of the project, who said that it made a difference in who they voted, used it to share with Crazy Uncle Pedro in their WhatsApp group. So it actually became something that was people in our evaluation said was useful, and we did the same in Nigeria. So we're now recognizing that when it comes to disinformation, we have to actually collaborate, and when we do that, it drives up trust with audiences, and it makes resourcing much easier to do, because the other truth is that lots of skills in newsrooms around this are pretty low. Like, journalists aren't used to digging out the stuff that's untrue. So when you say, can you find rumors and misinformation, and more importantly, can you decide when to report? So the challenge that journalism has now is, if we report on these rumors too early, we give them additional oxygen. But if we wait too late, it's out the gate and you can't bring it back. Like Pizzagate or other big conspiracies that we didn't tackle because we're like, nobody's going to believe that there's a sex pedophile ring in a pizza basement in DC. Turns out a lot of people did believe that, and it's impossible to pull back. And when you work as a collaboration, the newsrooms are actually having conversations like, are you going to run with that? Well, not if you're not going to. So actually, when you start talking to each other, then it actually does a really strong job of improving the quality of the reporting around disinformation, because we haven't worked out best practices yet. We're doing it as we speak.
Can I just add something very interesting about this project in Brazil that Comprova? I think I found very interesting because they had a channel in the website and say, like, to the just common people could, and they say, like, ask us, do you have a question? Do you receive like a message, you are not sure if that's true or not? Ask us. And I think this direct channel with the population is something interesting, because they're not just passive waiting or just publishing your website like, oh, this is the truth, but they're trying to connect to the community. Like common people say, like, send to us or your messages or your images, and you verify it. So it was more interactive, and I think it was a big, important point in this project, because it was very trying to build a relationship with the people.
Thank you for saying that, because I think we should talk a little bit more about WhatsApp, because I think the dynamics, particularly in the US, is that we think about WhatsApp for potentially talking about going for drinks in bars. We don't include you. But actually, what we don't think about is that Twitter and Facebook, they are broadcast mechanisms. WhatsApp is peer-to-peer communication, and the reason that it's so powerful is that you're much more likely to trust your closest friends. So the problem is, when we're trying to debunk this on WhatsApp, if somebody said to us in Comprova, was it true? When you send it back to them, they go, oh, thanks, and then they share with their networks. And it's much more powerful because it's coming from people who trust each other rather than a news brand who's trying to build trust. And Modi and Bolsonaro understood that dynamic. They've spent 4 years building up these groups on WhatsApp, and their material goes with speed through these groups. Journalists and fact checkers are saying, well, how do we push our stuff out on WhatsApp? Well, we can't push our stuff up on WhatsApp because there isn't a broadcast mechanism. But if you say to journalists, you should have spent 4 years building up groups on WhatsApp to disseminate your information, journalists will say, well, that's advocacy. We don't do advocacy. Mm-hmm. So the challenge in this space is how to fight when on one side you have people who understand the mechanisms on WhatsApp, and the journalism side, journalists have never had to deal with that peer-to-peer messaging. It's always been broadcast, and I think that's one thing that we just have not got our heads around enough yet.
But I would say that one of the biggest shifts I've seen since, let's say, Pizzagate or even 2015 is the recognition in newsrooms that I think previously, 3-4 years ago, we defined our job as only reporting on what's true.
Agree.
And I think the how is what we're still struggling with, but
Yeah.
now there's widespread, BuzzFeed does a great job on Twitter
Yeah.
of going out and debunking stuff that's trending. And I think we've internalized the fact that our role has changed, and our role is to put out the truth and also to get in front of things that aren't true.
Yeah.
And change that conversation before it takes off.
I agree.
How you do it is.
Yeah.
I also recognize something else. In the technology world itself, there's a realization of what kind of damage some of the technology is doing. So I look at the big picture. I keep thinking about, how much computing power can you put in an individual that he can do whatever he wants, pretty much. You're not concerned about deepfake. I really am. I don't think it's 5 years away at all. Actually, Claire was at TED last week, and so was I. And one of the striking moments for me was when, I don't know if you were there for the talk.
Yeah, the guy with the robot, with the fake.
No,
thing.
the Russian scientist from Google, Ivan Popovich, he actually produced a jacket which was essentially a computer. You can now weave in, you don't even need screen and keyboard anymore. He actually, the number he threw out was just staggering. 150 billion items of clothing. He said every one of them can be a computer. You can actually weave in, you can put enormous amount of computing power in a button now, right? And you don't need keyboard, you don't need screen. And I can imagine, and I go to TED every year to learn about these kind of crazy things, and I know maybe 5-6 years ago, this would have been greeted with applause and everyone would have stood up and cheered. This time when he presented this, literally the response was, are you kidding? You can't do that. Do you realize how much surveillance there would be in the world? So I think in the technology world itself, although incredible advances are being made, there is a realization that we may be going down the slippery, we already have, I guess.
Yeah. Just very quickly with that guy, I met him before he did his talk, and he was telling me about this. And I said, so how long have you been thinking about the unintended consequences? And he said, oh no, we don't bother with that, because if you can't actually build it, what's the point of thinking about the unintended consequences?
Right,
And I had this moment of like, that's why we're in this mess. Because he said, now we've built it, now we're thinking about the unintended
Somebody
consequences.
asked him, and he
just
said, I'm just an engineer.
Yeah, he said the same to me. And I was like, screwed.
He was running this entire presentation by just, swiping his sleeve. He'd do this and the whole display would change.
Yeah, and that's what someone said to us in one of the interviews, that all of these technologists who invented this stuff never studied civics.
It's true.
Yeah, this actually, 3 or 4 years ago when Sergey Brin brought out his Google Glass, this was also at TED. I think that was probably the turning point. Everyone realized how spooky it is that you walk around, voice command, and you're just taping the whole thing without telling anybody. And I think they invented a term called glass holes.
Yeah, but if he'd spent more time with journalists, he would never have come up with Google Glass.
Yeah.
I'm just going to say that again.
If you find Claire's comments interesting, you can also look up her TED Talk, which she gave a week ago.
It's not online yet.
Oh, really?
Thank God. Yeah.
So I guess the platforms are getting better at censoring content.
Yes.
So I want to have one last point or conversation before we take a few questions and wrap this up. Just to be clear, I'm curious what you guys think of. One of the final points in our film is that we love a good, healthy, lovely fact check. No one is against it. But we make the argument that to truly beat disinformation, it needs to be treated as information warfare, which requires military intervention and money from a government and a policy to be committed. And of course, I'm referring to disinformation that's coming from foreign countries. So China, North Korea, Iran, Russia are a lot of countries that are waging disinformation at Americans. Our commitment to fighting this is currently through the State Department. The budget is pathetic. It took 18 months to even arrive after it was signed. President Obama was years late on this. It was only once Trump took office that he actually changed the writing that we could even fight disinformation, because Obama had defined it so narrowly that it only counted if it was from an Islamic terror or from a terrorist organization. So Obama was completely asleep on this for years. And I think it's great that journalists think about this stuff and are trying to get better at debunking stuff on Twitter. But I feel like we're like 5 or 10% of the solution, and we put ourselves front and center because it feels so heavy to us. But when I look at countries that are fighting this most effectively, I look to Eastern Europe, which are years ahead of us, and they're treating it in the military. They have, the Czech Republic treats disinformation as a form of terrorism. Estonia has a volunteer cyber brigade that's basically like a digital national guard. Ukraine had a disinformation ministry, which presents its own set of problems. But I am just curious if there are any examples in your countries where it is, or anywhere in your continents where it's being treated at that level, or if you think that's unfair. But I think sometimes we're a bit delusional in how important we are to this process and what the real lever is.
Actually, like I said, these tactics are old. It's just the technology and tools are new. I can actually, in India, there are a lot of laws that predate Indian independence, going back to British era. So the Indian Penal Code, I think there's a section 505, which is very broad, which actually says the police can arrest you for spreading malicious rumor, gossip. It covers a whole. Literally, you can apply it even today. I mean, you don't need any modern new law. This is a British era law of 1896 or something like that. So, I mean, I don't know whether they've used it in any particular case, but definitely the police and the government has, the wherewithal. It's just that a lot of leaders, a lot of politicians have discovered how easy it is to, bend truth to their benefit. I always thought only time and space. Now I know that even truth can be bent.
Claire?
So obviously, this is a global and complex problem, and I know right now we're sitting in the US, and the US feels that it has been under attack, but we also need to recognize that America has played a role in other countries, Brazil, and other countries in terms of thinking about this. So this is a global complex problem, and we do have to think about some of this from a national security perspective, but we also have to recognize some of this is for ad and financial purposes, and there are different ways that we should be thinking about that. Ultimately, the only way to solve this is multi-pronged. So yes, the platforms have a part to play, the governments have a part to play, journalists have a part to play, civil society. We haven't talked enough about media literacy, and it feels unsexy to talk about media literacy because it's going to take decades for us to actually educate people to be as critical as they need to be, and people want a quick fix, but we're not starting quickly enough, and we're not doing enough evaluations around media literacy. So we're throwing money, but in some instances we're seeing that we're actually making people less trustful of any information. So we have to be really careful about this, but what you're saying is true. We do need to think about this from a national security perspective, but the way that Russia used these platforms during 2016 is they used the platforms as they were designed to be used. So when we think about what do we do here, yes, we should be tracking much more about behaviors, because when we start thinking about regulating content, it becomes really complicated, and a lot of this is around who makes these decisions around content. When we look to see, well, actually, this content was amplified by this network at exactly the same time, and they all seem to have IP addresses that are based here, then that kind of obvious coordinated attempts at manipulation, there's something we can do about it. And that's, I think, what we need to think about it from a national security perspective. But the answer that any one sector can solve this is false, but every sector, from educators to librarians to journalists to the government, but also this is the wider information ecosystem. I know we're sitting in a journalism conference, but there's a lot of terrible journalism. And whenever we do terrible journalism, it drives down trust. There are elected officials that push this stuff too. So when we say, well, it's just the platforms that have to sort this out, there's a much bigger challenge around all of us.
When was the last time you were at a disinformation conference with a national security person on a panel?
So actually, let's also have a conversation about that. So the challenge that we have is, because it's disinformation, we all say we're all in this together. And I was at an event in December, and when nobody did introductions, and halfway through the afternoon, Guy puts his hand up and says, "Hi, I'm Clint, I'm from Homeland Security." And I was like, "Clint, I wouldn't have said half the things I'd said to you today if I'd known that you were from Homeland Security." And I do think in journalism, there's always been a much clearer set of where are the lines. And I think when it comes to disinformation, we all say, well, we're all into this because we all want to fight disinformation. You know, I was on a panel once with a guy from the State Department, and I was talking about the French project. He said, "Oh, we were doing the same thing, telling people in France about how great American elections were." And I was like, that makes me feel really uncomfortable. But I understand, you know, and he was talking about having a meme tracker. And I was like, I want your meme tracker, but I can't because you're the State Department.
Right.
Like, and the State Department wants to fund us. I'm like, I don't want to take it. Like, this is much, much more complex than let's all fight for truth. And I think some of that complexity gets lost because we don't want to think about the complexity, but we have to.
There's a really funny example, sad but funny example of when I think it was about 8 years ago, the Center for Global Engagement in the State Department started making videos to try to win hearts and minds in the Islamic world. It was basically debunking Islamic disinformation. But because of their rules and regulations, they had to start every video by saying the following message is brought to you by the U.S. State Department, which is basically saying, dear people, we are trying to convert. You hate us, but please listen in.
But we're being transparent because we're Americans.
Right. So I'm sure some people in the Kremlin were laughing at that.
Did they also have a television channel in the Middle East, I remember?
Yeah, they do.
I forget,
Okay, well, we can take a few questions before we wrap up. Yes?
This is Radio Free Europe. I mean, we did this all during World War II. We're great at this. It's advertising. Go ahead. No, that's a... No, I'm just saying that it's going to be very difficult to spice between what's advertising, where you're purposely just misleading somebody to buy a toothpaste, or putting a doctor's coat on, and saying that it's effective. I don't know how you could do it except through a private organization, that's funded privately without the government or a corporation. And ProPublica's trying to do stuff. How about Snopes? That's private. I could see with that. I don't know how you could do it on a state level, actually. But anyway.
No, I agree with you. The capacity that you need to monitor this kind of content and the way that you connect other signals around people is important. But that's a particular type of disinformation. Yeah.
So how does this apply to us for 2020 U.S. elections? What kind of infrastructure is being built here, if at all, to collaborate, to share information, to debunk what needs to be debunked? Is there anything? Is there any appetite for anything?
Can I answer quickly, then I'll be quiet. So the real vulnerability in the US is local, because of local news deserts and the absence of, just there's not enough journalists. And we already know that a disinformation tactic is that you try and target local reporters, because they tend to have fewer skills, fewer resources, and it's very easy because people are more trusting to, we already know that you create something that sounds like the Minneapolis Tribune digital company, and people go, oh yeah, that's my local newspaper, without necessarily knowing that it's not. So the model that we used in France and Brazil, because America is so complex and large and competitive, what we're hoping to do is to have different cross-check models in different state and local levels to bring in concerned citizens, librarians, journalism students, and local newsrooms to try and create this kind of capacity. Because I think if we don't do that, if we just focus, no offense, but New York Times and Washington Post and CNN, this is really going to happen at a local level. And I think we just need many, many more eyes on local Facebook groups and Instagram and places that journalists just can't be looking in all those places. So I think one of the groups that you talked about in Estonia or something is this like digital citizens brigade, and that makes me feel uncomfortable. But what I also like about this model is it becomes a media literacy tool, because by teaching people to be watchful and to start doing some of this verification, you're teaching them how to do this model, but within a framework where they've got journalists, cross-checking and editing and being part of that process. So who knows whether we get funded, but there's quite a few people who really want to do something serious around 2020.
Yeah, and a lot of if you read Mueller's indictment of the Internet Research Agency and the people behind it, almost all of the cases that he documented in astonishing detail were in small towns in the U.S. I think it was Sioux Falls, Idaho, and the one in Texas, and the one in northern Florida.
And the scariness is actually moving it offline, so creating Facebook events pages on both sides, and then getting Americans to get out and protest against each other, and it was all puppeted from Moscow.
But those were all in local areas. I mean, one was outside of Houston, but all the others were small towns and states with small populations.
And no newspapers.
Yes.
Or dying newspapers.
Yeah.
And Sinclair is their television station. That's the real thing. Like, is there any way to stop the concentration of ownership? I mean, Sinclair's been able to buy up so many television stations just since the crash on bonds that have very strange covenants. It's like, that is where you can stop it. And we used to do that. Right?
Well, if we keep thinking about the platforms as being the only vehicles for misinformation or disinformation, we're missing so much of these other factors that are really important. But it makes us feel uncomfortable in the news industry to talk about it, but we do have to.
I think a lot of journalists today are wrestling with the legacy of impartiality and neutrality, and so. The question basically is, going forward, do we have to be more advocates for truth and not worry so much about looking impartial or neutral? It strikes me that in a fascist regime, there's nothing more irrelevant than the question of, are you neutral? Because it would be assumed if you're not under the control of the regime, you're part of the underground. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are about impartiality, the future of impartiality.
It's a great question for a New York Times reporter.
I'm on the opinion side now, so.
Yeah, I don't know. I've struggled with it, and I can tell you, as a foreign correspondent, I think at the luncheon somebody mentioned that there's a sort of almost a unspoken alliance of alt-right movements in various countries, U.S., India, Brazil, and so on. And I know from my experience of the past 2 years, my coverage of whatever happens in Washington, I was very quickly branded as anti-Trump by my Indian readership. The amount of hate mail I got was quite staggering. And I had to protest, because basically you just have to report what's happening in Washington straight up. You don't have to, infuse anything into it. Just factual reporting will put you in the anti-Trump camp. It's such a crazy time. But one of the things, ideas I've been processing is, a lot of us who belong to the legacy media, I mean, I go back to the journalism. I started my career on a typewriter and teleprinter. We cling on to this old forms of journalism, which is literary journalism, dying, and not enough of us, I feel, are making the transition into the modern digital, from analog to digital. I know, for instance, most newspapers in the world, big newspapers, have laid off a lot of journalists. Where are they? I would assume there should be 100 New York Times, reporters who are basically well-trained and well-equipped in the digital world, having their own platforms. I know it's not worked very well. I mean, I think Andrew Sullivan and a bunch of others tried with considerable funding, didn't succeed. But eventually the marketplace will take care of it. Some people will succeed. So I can't, for the life of me, understand why a prominent New York Times journalist hasn't become a media brand himself or herself.
Liability. They can sue you right out of your everything you've ever owned, and they've done that, and then remember that, as parents all the time. So that's one reason.
Interesting, yeah.
Can I just add something? I don't have an answer, but I'm concerned about something that we as a journalists usually we think the solution, like against fake, like misinformation, disinformation, is fact-checking. And I love fact-checking. I think it's very important. But there's some research showing that people, even after fact-checking, people don't believe. They just think, oh, I don't care. Like I still stick with my opinion, as if the facts don't matter, as if everything is about opinion. And I think this is a big challenge for us as a journalist, think how could we build this trust with the public, and in a way they could believe us, because it seems like now is a question of I believe you or I don't. And I don't know, I think it's a new issue. We should think about that beyond fact-checking. I think fact-checking is very, very important, but I think we need to go beyond that. And I don't know yet how we can do that, but maybe together we should discuss more about that.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question.
My name's Emily Burns.
Thank you.
My name's Emily, and I'm with the Society of Environmental Journalists. And, environmental and health reporters have been we're dealing with a lot of this misinfo and malinfo, I think, before many other beats in the democratic world. And so folks might want to look to our beats to see how we've been grappling with that. But based somewhat on that experience, I want to say this question of who owns the media is far, far, far from irrelevant to solving this problem, because one of the reasons that the petroleum industry's disinformation campaign on climate was so effective for so long was because it coincided with the consolidation of media ownership in this company and, this top-down demand for profitability from television news divisions that had previously been sort of the public interest side of the network. But if you don't want to upset advertisers, well, then you don't take a tough look at what's causing climate change. And so are any of you working on or aware of efforts to begin to reverse this trend of consolidation of media ownership in the U.S. or anywhere else?
I mean, to your point about health and science, I couldn't agree more. I mean, the lens through which this conversation happens in the US is around political disinformation and around Facebook, and the rest of the world, it's actually about science misinformation, and it's around closed messaging apps like WhatsApp. We just done a big study about anti-vax content online, and it's really horrifying. To your point about ownership, I mean, I don't know anybody who's working on it, and these forces are great. I think one thing that's healthy that I see in the US is the growth of non-profit newsrooms and a recognition that those kind of newsrooms have more freedom. And I think the incredible work of ProPublica has shown what that looks like. But you have got to the heart of a very, very tricky question that has been very tricky for a very long time. I used to sit at these conferences and say, yes, if only you had the BBC. But then watching the BBC during Brexit, I've changed my mind about that. So.
Okay, well, thank you all for joining us.
Media consolidation here, wide publishers, local independent online news publishers, and it's an effort to rebuild the local news industry with news organizations, primarily online, that are invested in their communities through local ownership rather than merely trying to profit from them. And really that is one of the most vital problems in news today, is the fact that most of the people who make the business decisions about what people read and watch don't have anything to do with the places where they are, and that needs to change.
Okay.